Okay. Good day, ladies and gents. This is going to be my long-threatened kind of movie review of the classic British film Zulu from 1964, but it's also going to look at the actual Battle of Rorke's Drift. I lived in South Africa for over 15 years, and at one stage I owned a property which was about 30 minutes motorbike ride from the actual Rorke's Drift. So I've been there, I don't know, 9 or 10 times, I suppose. I've also been to the Drakensberg where the movie was filmed, and I once climbed Giant's Castle, which is the big dramatic mountain in the background of the film, in a day. And when I came back down the next day, the local South Africans all told me everyone takes 2 days to do that, but I didn't know that, so I went up and came down in one day. But that's just me. So anyway, before we get on, I'm going to do my usual thing and play us a bit of stuff to allow people to get in here. And let me find out how to do that. I'm doing my boomer tag now. There we go. Come on. Okay, cool.
Damn funny. Like a train in the distance.
Go on, my dear.
Walking the mightiest. Towering over the greatest. Zulu. No. These are the days and nights of fury and honor, of courage and cowardice that an entire century of empire making and film making can never surpass. This is the day when 200 Zulu virgins and 200 Zulu warriors perform their fantastic wedding dance. This is the day a woman fights for her beliefs, among men fighting for their lives.
You're all going to die. Don't you realize? Can't you see? Die! Why is it us? Why us?
Because we're real, nobody else.
For every gunshot wound I probe, I expect to lance 3 boys.
A spot of medicinal brandy and set me up, sir.
Brandy's for heroes, Mr. Hook. Hey, that's my boy, Hook! Get a soldier now!
This is the Battle of Rorke's Drift. A day and night of death and defiance, when the British were outnumbered but not outfought, when 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded in the one day for valor and extreme courage, over and above the call of duty. A day that made history.
Okay, guys, so that's the theatrical trailer for Zulu. Now, I as I said, I lived in South Africa for over 15 years. Did a bit of fighting there, one way and another. And at one stage, I had a property that was about 30 minutes motorcycle ride from the actual Rorke Drift. Been there many times. It doesn't look like it looks in the film. Now, the film was filmed in the Drakensberg Mountains. It gives you very dramatic backgrounds. For example, the classic one in the movie Zulu is Giant's Castle, which is a series of mountains in Drakensberg. And I have climbed that mountain, and as I say, I did it in one day and came down the same day. But I was young and fit in those days, which I sure ain't now. But yeah, but the actual place where Zulu was fought, Rorke Drift, looks much more like this, which I will shortly show you. There we go. How do I do this? Sorry guys, I'm doing boom attack at the moment. Absolutely boom attack in most respects. Yeah, there we go. That is an actual good map of the real Rorke Drift. As you can see, on the left of the picture is the hospital building. On the right of the picture is the storehouse building. There's a well-built stone kraal, which is corral, on the right, with a wall mostly dividing it. And the rest of it is, you can see there are two wagons on the back wall, which were actually not tipped over as they were in the film. They were left on their wheels, and stuff was stuck under them and stuck on top of them. And the rest of it is mostly mealie bags, which is to say Indian bags full of Indian corn, which would have acted very much like sandbags. All around the place, and also biscuit boxes, which were big wooden boxes full of hardtack biscuits. That was one of the standard rations given to British soldiers. What you will also notice about this map is that there was a lot more cover for the Zulus than might have appeared to be the case in the movie. But another thing you need to realize is that the front wall, from where it says veranda to pretty much where the road that actually runs into the area is, there was a 1 to 2 foot rocky bank that the Brits put their mealie bag walls on, so that when the Zulus were attacking, there was somewhere between 5 to 7 foot of wall that they had to get over, which was quite considerable. and actually good tactics on the part of the Brits that did it. But also notice there's a ditch behind the place, and where it says Oscarberg Terraces, that's leading up to a fairly high hill, which is like 500 or 600 foot high. That's actually behind the Swedish mission station of Rorke's Drift, and it is incidentally still a Scandinavian mission station. So yeah, that's what Rorke's Drift really looks like. Yeah, I suppose it does. The Brits first of all pushed out that veranda area, and then they had to eventually retreat to the wall, which is marked number 2 on that thing. And then the Zulus attacked the kraal on the right, and the Brits for a while held the wall that kind of divides that about a third of the way in, and at one stage launched a bayonet attack to chuck some of them out. But eventually the Brits were holding the position that is basically the yellow storehouse building and the deep red bit. That was what they finished up holding. Although some soldiers actually did survive outside the area. But anyway, let's look at the movie first. The movie, the director was Cy Enfield. Cy Enfield came across the UK because he was one of those left-wing socialist communists chucked out of America by McCarthy. And years ago, I would have said, well, that was really unfair. But actually, these days, having learned a little bit more about that history, it probably was totally fair. McCarthy wasn't a bad guy. McCarthy just didn't go far enough, in my opinion. So yeah. But on the other hand, Zulu is a perfectly good movie. You've also got to look at the fact that it was partly made because Stanley Baker was a very proud Welshman, and he also got another Welshman, Sir Richard Burton, to do some of the narration in the film. But that's not strictly historically true. In 1879, during the Anglo-Zulu War, the 24th Regiment of Foot was not the South Wales border, as it was the Warwickshire Regiment. The 1st Battalion, most of which, not all, but most of which was killed at Isandlwana on the day before, or actually the same day as Rorke's Drift. The 1st Battalion, to some degree, was a Welsh battalion. The 2nd Battalion really wasn't. There were more Londoners at Rorke's Drift than there were Welshmen, which you certainly wouldn't get from the movie. But it is a fact. There were more guys born in the environs of London at Rorke's Drift than there were Welshmen. Not true at Isandlwana. There were probably a small minority of Welshmen who were killed. And those guys were extremely brave and often overlooked. But at Rorke's Drift, the 2nd Battalion was a more English battalion. He recruited pretty heavily in Birmingham, and sure, he recruited some Welsh guys who moved to Birmingham. But for the most part, wasn't particularly Welsh. Really, the 24th Foot only really became specifically Welsh in 1881 when they became the South Wales Borderers. And as the regimental title kind of says, Even then, they were like mostly Welsh, but not totally, because that's where they recruited from. So, there you go. The singing of Men of Harlech and all that kind of stuff that goes on in the movie certainly didn't happen in real life. I have seen someone say that it's based on Major Wilson's patrol in Rhodesia in the 1890s, where they certainly did sing God Save the Queen before the Mahabili overwhelmed them. And I've seen people say that's where that thing in the movie comes from, and yeah, it might be true. But the idea that British soldiers who are fighting the enemy, when they're outnumbered 45-1, are going to start singing songs is unlikely, to say the least. So that's that. Zulu is a great film. Don't get me wrong. It's probably my favorite film. My dad took me to see Zulu when I was about 6 or 7. Like it had been re-released, and my mother apparently said, "No, he's too little. Don't take him. You won't like it." Whereas actually, I was enthralled and remembered it all my life until I was a bit older and could go and see it again. But there we go. That's just me. It was a great movie. Michael Caine, who was a national serviceman in the Korean War, I think in the Royal Artillery, if I remember rightly, he said he based his Lieutenant Bromhead on British officers he had met in the Korean War in like 1951-52. And yeah, as a former British soldier myself, I can kind of see that. But that was when the British Army was still pretty cool, rather than the cucked PC nonsense that it is today. Sorry, I was just looking at my little dog. But yeah, so there's that. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these commanders. Yeah. Now this chap is Lieutenant John Rouse Marriott-Chard, Royal Engineers. He was the officer commanding at Rorke's Drift. He's the guy that Stanley Baker plays in the movie. By every single, I've been to his grave, which is in a little village in Somerset, where his brother ran the church. And I've put flowers on this dude's grave, and I actually killed my first ever car I had, which was an Austin Allegro, driving to his grave and then going on from there to Brecon. But that taught me not to buy Austin cars. But anyway, John Rouse Marriott-Chard was the Royal Engineer officer who was the senior officer and therefore the officer commanding at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. This is the dude who Stanley Baker played. Everybody I've read about him says that he was promoted from lieutenant to major without going through captain, which is extremely unusual. Like, no one does that in the British Army. Got his Victoria Cross and could have pretty much done a lot of things in the British Army, but he was not very ambitious. He was not very active. He was not very, trying to think of the right word. Like he was content to be who he was. Did very well at Rorke's Drift. He was a Royal Engineer officer, and the place got fortified, and it got fortified pretty well, partly because of this chap, although more because of another chap we'll talk about in a bit. But Chard was not the most ambitious officer in the world, and a lot of senior officers were quite disappointed in him after he got his VC for Rorke's Drift. He eventually got cancer of the throat or cancer of the tongue, I can't remember, and died in the 1890s. And like I said, I've been to his grave in Somerset. Very brave soldier, but not necessarily the most admirable officer in the world, I suppose. That's one way you might describe that. So then we're going to move on, and we're going to look at Lieutenant Bromhead. Where are we? I think this. There we go. Yep. Right. Now here we have Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. Now, Bromhead, this is the bloke that Michael Caine played in the film. Bromhead was left behind with his company at Rorke's Drift. Now, Rorke's Drift was a base for supplies and a field hospital for the column that had gone into Zululand. And Bromhead was left behind because he was very deaf. He was so deaf that he couldn't actually hear shouted orders on a parade ground. Not to say that he wasn't a very brave man, because he was, without a doubt. Not to say many of his company didn't like him, but he was quite deaf, and that was why he and his company were left behind at this commissariat base and field hospital to defend it, rather than taking part in the invasion of Zululand in 1879. So that's Gonville Bromhead. Now, he eventually died of typhoid in India, and he's buried today in Allahabad in India. He took part after the Anglo-Zulu War. He took part in another campaign in Burma. Then he was sent back to India, and he died from typhoid fever in Allahabad and is buried there. So there we go. That's the chap who Michael Caine played. So let us move on. Looking at the movie, rather than the actual battle, you can see that both sides are treated pretty fairly. Like the British soldiers are brave, but also the Zulus are brave. And they were. Absolutely true. Got no problem with that. There are some big mistakes in the movie. For example, the Scandinavian missionary guy at the beginning of the film is supposed to be at Ulundi, and then drives his Cape cart from Ulundi to Rorke's Drift in less than a day. There were no roads in Zululand at that time, and it would have taken somebody in a car, if the wheels didn't break, I don't know, 4, 5, maybe even 6 days to go from Rorke's Drift to Ulundi. Ulundi was a long way from Rorke's Drift, where there were no roads particularly. So that's nonsense. It simply didn't happen. The wits are also shown with the guy's daughter there, which is actually nonsense also, because although Wit was actually the Swedish missionary at Rorke's Drift, he'd sent his family away a long time before that. Mind you, that did not stop him having a lecture tour for quite a long time after the battle, saying that he'd been at Rorke's Drift and his Anna when he actually was not either of those powers, but that's what went on. I wouldn't say it was Jack Hawkins' greatest role, to be honest with you. I like Jack Hawkins, particularly as the skipper in the Cruel Sea, when he is superb. But his role as Wit the missionary in Zulu is not his greatest role. The other thing in Zulu is there's rivalry between John Chard and Gonville Bromhead about who should command. Absolute nonsense. Again, why would there be? The British Army rule and the rule of like 95% of militaries in the world is that the senior officer has command. And like there was no doubt that Chard was senior to Bromhead. And the fact that Chard was a Royal Engineer and Bromhead was infantry didn't really make any difference because the Royal Engineers were a combat arm and are a combat arm. The combat arms of the armed forces are the infantry, the cavalry, the artillery, and the engineers. So all of that stuff was basically nonsense that was just put in there to, I don't know, make people find it more interesting. I don't know. There's quite a lot of things in the 1960s. I love Zulu as a movie, but there's quite a lot of stuff in it, which is of the 1960s and certainly has nothing whatever to do with Britain or the British Army in 1879. Like nothing whatsoever. So there's that. Now, let's have a look at another guy. Here we go. That's the one I want. Sorry, guys, I'm doing Boomer Tech here, but you know how it goes. Now, this chap is somebody who is quite important to the real story of Rorke's Drift. He is James Langley Dalton. If you watch the film, you'll see him maybe twice, I think, in the movie, and he is shown as a very posh chap who helps out one of the cooks and then gets killed later in the battle. Both nonsense. James Langley Dalton was actually a regular army British sergeant who had settled in South Africa and rejoined the army and became a commissariat officer, which is to say a supply officer. But because he was an experienced sergeant, it was actually him who persuaded John Chard and Gonville Bromhead that trying to retreat from Rorke's Drift was a waste of time. The Zulus would overtake the British troops on the road, which they probably would have done, and the British troops in the open, being given there was like only just over 100 of them, would be slaughtered. And so there was a better chance if the British soldiers fortified the position and tried to fight it out. And James Langley Dalton, this chap in the photograph, it was him who actually played one of the major parts in persuading both Chard and Bromhead that, yeah, okay, we ought to stay where we are, fortify the position as much as we can, protect the sick and wounded that we've got in our hospital, and just try and hold out. And like I say, he was badly portrayed in the film as this posh kind of bloke, which he wasn't. Like I said, he was a long serve. You can see his medal ribbons there on the left-hand side of his tunic. He was a long service, quite experienced NCO who had joined the Commissariat Corps. And generally speaking, he was a bloke. So there's that. Where are we going? Let me get rid of all. There we go. Okay, now the next guy I'm going to talk about is Frank Bourne. Now, Frank Bourne is the colour sergeant of the troops at Rorke's Drift. And in the film, he's superbly played by Nigel Green. Really, really good performance. Nigel Green's and Colour Sergeant Bourne, one of the major characters of the movie. He's kind of like the eternal sergeant type thing. But the real Frank Bourne was actually called the Kid by the men because he was only 23 years old. He promoted very quickly because he was a very intelligent young chap. He used to write letters home for some of the blokes who didn't write very well and this kind of thing. And yeah, Frank Bourne was a very extraordinary British soldier. He was offered a commission after the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which he refused because he didn't think he could afford to do that. But he was such a good soldier that after further service in other campaigns, in the I think it was about 1890, he was commissioned, even though he'd refused a commission before that in 1879. And he went on, got promoted, and rejoined the British Army again in World War I, where he was assigned to musketry instruction, which is to say like marksmanship and shooting with the short magazine and the Enfield. And he actually ended up a lieutenant colonel. And let us show you Lieutenant Colonel Frank Bourne. There we go. That is Lieutenant Colonel Frank Bourne. And he didn't die until after the D-Day landings in 1944 in the Second World War. He was the last British survivor of the Battle of Rorke's Drift, insofar as anyone knows. And as I say, he was still there. He actually saw the successful British, Canadian, and American landings on D-Day in 1944 before he died. And an outstanding British soldier. You know, you don't go from being a private to being a lieutenant colonel if you're not an outstanding British soldier. Pardon me 1 second, guys. I'm just going to speak to somebody. I'll do. So yeah, that's Frank Bourne. As I say, Lieutenant Colonel in the British Army eventually, and he was the colour sergeant at Rorke's Drift, and the blokes actually called him the Kid because he was only 23 years old, which was extremely young to be a colour sergeant. And a colour sergeant in the late 1870s, early 1880s would kind of be the same as a company sergeant major today, because there was no such thing as a company sergeant major back then. So you've got to look at Frank Bourne as being a company sergeant major at 23, and that's you couldn't do that today, I don't think. I've never heard of any British soldier who became a company sergeant major at 23. So he was an extraordinary soldier and a really good chap. Won the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his performance at Rorke's Drift. And just a damn good British soldier, basically. So, yeah. Okay, we're going to have a look at something else now, because we should. Okay, we'll do that one next thing. Okay, now this is a famous painting. It was done by Lady Butler, who was the wife of a Irish British general in the 19th century, and includes quite a lot of people who were actually in the battle. So if you look at the bloke in the dark jacket in the left center of the screen who is shouting to someone, that is supposedly Frederick Schiess, the Swiss guy who won a VC, who originally fought in the Natal Native contingent as an NCO. You can see Fred Hitch on the left of the screen carrying ammunition. You can see Sergeant Major Reynolds next to Hitch, but behind him in the dark coat looking after a wounded guy. You can see Chard pointing in the white breeches, and next to him is Goldwell Bromhead. And there are one or two other recognizable people. And because Lady Butler was the wife of a British Army general, she was able to get all these guys to come and pose for her. And this painting was originally done for Queen Victoria. It ain't a bad picture, in my view. However, my favorite picture of my favorite painting of Rorke's Drift is the one we're going to do just now, which is this one. As I said, I've been to Rorke's Drift, I don't know, maybe a dozen times, certainly 10 times. And this picture, I think, is the most accurate one I've seen. You can see there's a small gap between the hospital on the left, the hospital on the right and the storehouse on the left. There's only a small gap, and you can see the wagon wheels of the wagons that were, as I said, not tipped over, but actually like covered in biscuit boxes and mealie bags to make a protection. And you can see there's not much space there, so the Zulu's got nowhere that way. You can also see in this photograph, the guys are being evacuated from the hospital and carried across to the storehouse area. You can see Goldwell Bromhead in the middle of the photograph pointing out something about the enemy. To his right, you can see a guy in a dark coat. That's Ammunition Smith. Not in the movie for some reason, but he was actually a British Army chaplain chap who went around through the whole battle giving out ammunition. Not shown in the movie, but he was actually there. To his left, wearing a forage cap, you can see Sergeant Reynolds, and he's treating a wounded guy. And next to him is Sergeant Reynolds' dog, who actually bit a Zulu during the battle, who attacked his master, which I always think is a very cool story. And if you go forward from Sergeant Reynolds, the guy, Ammunition Smith, the guy doing that, you can see he's giving ammunition to a soldier who's reaching out for it. And just beyond him, in the kind of form breeches, that is Lieutenant Chard fighting on the front line of the mealie bag redoubt alongside his men. And giving him ammunition, crawling towards him, is a corporal who also ended up winning a VC not only for that, but for other brave acts during the battle. You can see that the hospital roof is on fire because the Zulus managed to set it on fire. And in the background on the left-hand side of the picture is the Oscarberg Mountain, which the Zulus called Cheyenne, which means eyebrow, pretty much. So there you go. That's that particular picture. There were, at Rorke's Drift, about 100 and slightly under 140 British soldiers. About 87 of those were B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, the Warwickshire Regiment in those days, although they became the South Wales Borderers in 1881. The rest of them were guys who were wounded or sick from the column that had gone into Zululand. And as I said before, there were actually more Londoners at Rorke's Drift than there were Welshmen. Because, as I said, the Royal Warwickshire Regiment only became the South Wales Borderers in 1881. They weren't the South Wales Borderers in 1879. There were Welshmen in that regiment, obviously. And there were more Welshmen in the 1st Battalion that mostly got slaughtered at Isandlwana than there were in B Company of the 2nd Battalion that held Rorke's Drift. There were a couple of Irishmen at Rorke's Drift. There was one Scotsman and a lot of Englishmen and a fair number of Welshmen. Now, they were attacked by the Undi Corps, which was a group of 3 Zulu age regiments. The Zulus put everyone into an age regiment when they got to about somewhere between 16 and 19. An Ibutho, it was called in Zulu. And they put all these guys into a regiment, and regiments varied in size. So newer, younger regiments tended to be huge. There were regiments in 1879 that had almost 4,000 or 5,000 men in them. But there were older regiments that had maybe 600 or 700 men in them because of the different ages. And a age regiment and a Bufo would be given permission to marry by the Zulu king at some point, often for something they did in a military action. And the Undi Corps was commanded, it was the Zulu Reserve at the Battle of Isandlwana, where something like 25,000 Zulus absolutely destroyed a British column of roughly 1,500 soldiers. About 700 of those were British regulars, and the rest were a mixture of colonial volunteers and native levies. And very few of them escaped. So the Undi Corps, under the Zulu king was a bloke called Hwayo, and his half-brother, Double Amanzi, was in command of the Zulu Reserve. Now, Hwayo had actually told Double Amanzi not to invade Natal. Natal was a British colony. In 1879, South Africa consisted of 2 Afrikaner Boer republics, that's to say the Orange Free State and what eventually became known as the Transvaal, whereas the Brits controlled the Cape Colony and Natal. And Rorke's Drift was on the Natal side of the Buffalo River. And Hwayo, the Zulu king, had actually told his half-brother Double Amanzi not to attack across the river. But because the Zulu Reserve didn't take part in the Battle of Isandlwana, Double Amanzi decided, no, we're going to go and attack this little British post. And his reserve Zulu force had about 4,500 warriors in it, from 4 very good regiments, including the Old Tawana, which was the Zulu King Hwayo's own age regiment that he had fought in as a younger man. They were extremely elite Zulu warriors. And he crossed the Buffalo River and he did attack Rorke's Drift. And he thought that 4,500 Zulus were going to wipe out the British post, which, like I said, was less than 150 British troops. He thought he would do that easily. Fortunately, because they got a bit of warning from survivors from Issa Luana, the Brits had started putting up their barricades, etc., before him. And then it was just a matter of firepower, discipline, and sheer guts. And so for over 12 hours, the Brits, who were outnumbered about 45 to 1, much of it in darkness. Like, one of the things you don't get from the movie Zulu is that the Zulus attacked at about 4 p.m. in the evening. And by 6, it was dark. So that a lot of the Battle of Rorke's Drift was actually fought in the dark. And the Zulus setting fire to the hospital building actually proved to be an advantage to the British, because the light of the flames allowed them to see their targets as all these hundreds of Zulu guys were charging towards them. Without that, perhaps the Brits might have even lost. But it was actually a very close fought battle. It was mostly fought in the dark, often at very close range. And the less than 150 British soldiers in the 12-hour battle fired over 22,000 rounds of ammunition. You got to think about that as a soldier. With a single shot Martini Henry rifle that had a maximum rate of fire of maybe 15 rounds a minute, more realistically probably 12, 150 blokes fired 22,000 rounds of ammunition. And the Zulus themselves were not short of firearms. One of the things that's often portrayed badly is that the Zulu army in 1879, which had somewhere between 30 and 40,000 warriors in it, they most certainly had over 20,000 firearms. Not all of them were modern. They had like a lot of smoothbore muskets. They had a lot of muzzle loading rifle muskets, like the Mini and the Enfield, the kind of thing that was used in the American Civil War. They had a lot of those. They did have some modern breech loaders, but not all that many. But they certainly had lots and lots of firearms. In fact, all the British accounts of battles in the Anglo-Zulu War talk about the large amount of small arms fire coming from the Zulus, although they often didn't understand how to use the sights correctly. So a lot of that fire went high, which was lucky for the soldiers facing them. So anyway, the Battle of Rorke's Drift, it was a very close fought action. Now, I'm now going to look at another guy. And this actually caused quite a few problems when the movie opened. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm being take that. Here we go. Now, this bloke is Albert Henry Hook Victoria Cross. And when the movie opened in the UK in 1964, his 2 elderly granddaughters both walked out of the cinema because they detested the way their grandfather was shown in the movie. If you look at Henry Hook in this photograph, he's wearing his Victoria Cross, obviously, and his Queen South Africa medal. But look at his parting in his head, and you'll see it's quite a big parting. And the reason for that is that during the battle, a Zulu actually flung an assegai, a spear, at the Henry Hook, and it went through his pith helmet and actually almost scalped him at the start of his forehead, and that's why his head looks like that. And Henry Hook got really bad headaches for the rest of his life as a result. But he was actually not the bad boy that he's shown in the film. In the movie, Henry Hook turns out to be a really brave soldier, but he's shown as a really kind of Queen's hard bargain as a soldier. Whereas in fact, Henry Hook was nothing like that whatsoever. The reason Henry Hook was assigned to defend the hospital was that he had earlier been detailed to make tea for the sick and wounded guys in the hospital. Henry Hook was actually a very, very good soldier, was never in trouble or anything. And that's why his two elderly granddaughters stormed out of the cinema in the UK in 1964 after they saw the way that he was portrayed in the film, because it was totally inaccurate. He was nothing like that. He was a very good soldier. Never did anything wrong, never got in trouble with the authorities, never was a barrack room lawyer or any of that stuff. He was just a damn good British soldier. But because the movie guys decided they needed a bad boy in the film, or they picked Henry Hook, but it was definitely not actually true at all. So I kind of agree with his granddaughters, to be honest with you. So there's that. I think we're probably getting most of the way through this stuff. Is there anything else I wanted to show on here? Sorry, guys, I'm being a bit of a shaky. Now, one of the things I did want to say is that Zulu was suggested by an article by a bloke called John Preble, and he was not a bad military historian. He wrote a good history of Culloden, the battle between Bonnie Prince Charlie and the English and Lowland Scottish forces. Like it wasn't an England versus Scotland thing. Like Edinburgh and Glasgow areas of Scotland were basically on the English side, not Bonnie Prince Charlie's. Bonnie Prince Charlie was mostly supported by the Highland Scots rather than the Lowland Scots, and they are, or were at least, two different people. But anyway, and I actually prefer the Highlanders. No, I don't really. I like Glaswegians. Yeah, that's not true. I like Glaswegians as well. But anyway, yeah, so John Preble, pretty good historian, little bit left wing, like most British historians since 1945, to be honest. Can't really say many of them weren't. So anyway, let's look at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. The guys were awarded 11 Victoria Crosses. That was more than the battle was worth, in all honesty. Although they were outnumbered 45-1 in a 12-hour fight. But they were awarded so many Victoria Crosses because of the disastrous Battle of Isandlwana, which had preceded it, where about 900 British and another 500 or 600 colonial and African troops had been killed by a Zulu army. Shush. Wait, stop it, idiots. Had been killed by a Zulu army of 20,000 blokes. So they got more VCs than they probably deserved. But it's still the most Victoria Crosses ever awarded for a single action in the history of the British Army. Like the Lancashire Fusiliers won 6 VCs before breakfast at Gallipoli in 1915. And Rorke's Drift got even more than that. And yeah, I like I said, I think they got slightly more than they should have done. But on the other hand, it was an extremely gallant defense, and they were vastly outnumbered. The movie's great. It's got a bit too much Welsh nationalism in it for reality, but I'm not going to slag it off for that, to be quite honest. Stanley Baker was a Welshman, like I said, and he got his mate Richard Burton, who was also a Welshman, to do the narration for the film. So he wasn't a bad guy, and I have nothing against Welshmen. Indeed, my mother's father was a Welshman who was in the RAF. So there we go. So yeah, I haven't got much more to say about it, really. About somewhere between 450 and 600 Zulus were killed in the battle, many more wounded. The British lost 15 dead and another 2 guys who died of their wounds. And a lot of the British guys, like probably even the majority of them, were more or less slightly wounded. Like, they got cut by an assegai or bashed in the face by somebody or something like that. It was a very hard fought battle. It was a very close fought battle, and it was fought at very close range. It lasted, as I said, for over 12 hours. And of that, about 7 or 8 hours were close hand-to-hand fighting. And just the last bit was the Zulu sniping and throwing assegais, throwing spears into the area the British were occupying. Major bad bits about the movie? Well, they didn't include Ammunition Smith, who was the British Padre chap who spent the whole battle going around telling people not to swear and giving them ammunition. Surgeon Major Reynolds, who was a British Army surgeon, in the movie turns around and says, "Damn you, Chard, damn all you butchers." Well, that's a completely 1960s point of view. There's no way that a British Army surgeon, I don't think a British Army surgeon would even say that today, let alone in 1879. So that was just a 1960s load of crap. Also, Bromhead, towards the end of the movie, turns around and says he feels ashamed because of all the people they've killed. Well, I've been a British Army soldier in action, and trust me, if you're alive and the enemy's dead, you don't feel ashamed. Not at all. Not even slightly. Not even a tiny little bit. You're happy that the enemy are dead and you're still alive. And anyone who says anything different is just talking nonsense. And again, that's a bit of 1960s anti-war propaganda that was put into the movie. And as I said right at the start, Cy Enfield, who directed the movie, good director, but he left America because McCarthy was after him as a Marxist communist. And my opinion these days is that McCarthy didn't go near far enough. So I suspect that is where most of these kind of 1960s socialist Marxist nonsense things come into the movie. This sort of thoughts Shangani Patrol were well worth looking into. Yes, Shangani Patrol is very interesting. There's a good book about that, a good historical novel about it. There's actually the Shangani Patrol movie is on YouTube if you want to go and look it up. It's quite a good film, actually. Well worth a watch. And there's also the pretty famous song from Rhodesia. So yeah, No problem with any of that. So yeah, there we have Rorke's Drift. Like I said, 450, 600 Zulus killed, 17 Brits killed, 140 odd Brits, some of whom were sick and wounded, versus 4,500 Zulu warriors, 12-hour battle. The movie's great. It's not entirely accurate, but it's great. Still my favorite film. And I think that's probably most of what I have to say about it, really. The Brits were on the Natal British side of the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift, and the Zulus were actually invading British territory. Oh, the other thing I would say is that the guy who plays Sheese in the movie, sorry, Sheese, is that right? No, it's not. The guy who plays Ardendorf, sorry, I beg your pardon. Ardendorf was the only bloke who fought at both Vicente Milana and Rorke's Drift. He was, I believe, an officer in the Natal native contingent. We don't know when he left Isla, but it must have been fairly early because he got to Rorke's Drift via a route that the Zulu right horn eventually cut. But he actually did stay at Rorke's Drift, and he fought quite hard. And according to Child's report, he did a considerable execution amongst Zulu warriors from a corner of the storehouse building through a loophole. Now, in that movie, Ardendorf turns around and says to Bromhead something like, no thanks. It depends what you damn English want for it afterwards. No thanks. I'm a Boer. The Zulu are the enemies of my blood. And what are you damned English doing here? Which is nonsense because Natal was a British colony. Like the Boers ran the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, which was the Transvaal. But although there were quite a lot of Afrikaners in Natal, one of my best mates was from a Voortrekker family who ended up in northern Natal. There were a lot of Afrikaners in Natal, but Natal was a British colony. It wasn't an Afrikaner territory. So that was a bit off too. But like I said, there's stuff like that. The Serengeti Patrol movie was based on the White Man Sang was the novel I was thinking of. I can't remember the name of the author now, but he's a good author. He's written quite a lot of very good historical books. So yeah, that bit again, not quite accurate. So yeah, I don't know that I have a lot more to say about this, to be honest. Hopefully you're never in a battle where you're outnumbered 45-1, because if you are and you win, you'll be damn lucky. But there we go. So anyway, guys, I'm going to play us out with a classic bit of stuff from the movie. There we go. Okay, ladies and gents, that's pretty much my look at Zulu and the Battle of Rorke's Drift, and Bayeti to the descendants of all the people who fought in that battle. Good night, folks.